Well, it's a few minutes before 7, and so some preliminary things before we get started. First of all, hopefully everybody can see this okay, and hopefully this time I won't break it like Jordan did last week. I don't have quite the power and influence over streaming that Jordan does. He is such a powerful influence, so I'm a lot more docile and kind with it. Second thing is, hope that this lesson tonight is beneficial. We're going to be in Numbers 21 and Deuteronomy chapter 2. This is going to be the lesson that would correspond to March 22nd in your folders. It's a lesson where the objective is faith depending upon God's protection. And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about tonight, depending on God's protection. Another thing I'd like for you to be aware of is if you haven't gotten a copy of this little pamphlet that Jordan has put together, Wilderness Wanderings, I would encourage you to do so. If you want to go on the website, thebibleway.com, Jordan has allowed that to be downloaded there, and it is a very, very useful tool for parents to help with children. In fact, I'm going to refer to some of it tonight. Jordan did an excellent job in putting that together, and so I really would like for you to have a copy of that and use that with your children as we go through this. Jordan did a good job of putting it all in just in story form and making some real life applications and offering some questions. In fact, some of the questions we'll talk about will be for the older kids. Another thing I'd like for you to do is, if you have availability, get yourself a couple of sheets of 8.5 by 11 paper, just regular standard paper. Also, you'll need a pencil or a marker of some kind, because we're going to attempt to do some drawing tonight. This is a dangerous endeavor for me. I'm not very artistic at all. And so we're going to try to do some drawing as it corresponds to the story tonight that will help our kids, I hope, follow what's going to take place in our story. When we think about this lesson, let's review something as we kind of work into it. Last week, Jordan talked to you about the fiery serpent, the children of God complaining, which was nothing new for them. They came right out of Egypt and immediately began complaining. Complained all the way through. For nearly 40 years of wandering, they complained. And God got sick and tired of it, enabled a serpent, a poisonous serpent, to come out and to bite those who failed to look upon the serpent up on the brazen pole and die. A matter of judgment for them. Also, just prior to this, Eleazar, Aaron's son, has been appointed high priest. And so you've just come through a significant series of events that Jordan covered with you last week in the brazen serpent. So this week we're going to go forward in Numbers chapter 21 and beginning in verse 10 and go through the end of the chapter. And by the time we get to the end of the chapter, we're going to shift to Deuteronomy chapter 2. So if you'd like to put your marker in Deuteronomy chapter 2, we'll do that. Hope you have had time to get your piece of paper and to be able to follow me and to kind of put together what I'm going to try to do with you this evening. If you got your piece of paper, draw sorry for holding that up crooked. Draw 3 boxes across the top and 3 boxes across the bottom. You'll need those. 3 boxes across the top, 3 boxes across the bottom. For our younger kids, parents may need to help them with this and try to help me teach this story with them. So I hope you've got your piece of paper and hope you've drawn the boxes. So let's begin. In the first box, I want you to write the words, the story. The story. Probably can't read that very well. The story. And that's because it helps us tell the story. It helps us tell the story of what's going to take place. the children of Israel have just come off this event with a brazen serpent, and now they're ready to move. And for the first little bit, they move. Things are peaceful. Things go great with them. Not a problem at all. And then the second phase of this, you come, if you'll write in that second box, they move. Hopefully something like that. Sorry for the poor graphics. That tells you how they began. So in Numbers chapter 21, beginning in verse 10, you see that as they begin to move, things really turn out quite well for them. It says, now the children of Israel moved on and camped in Oboth, and they journeyed from Oboth, and they carried all this land. They camped in the valley of Zered, and that's going to become important in a little bit. And there was peace. And notice in verses 14 and 15, there's a song. In verses 17 and 18, there's a song. It's interesting, when the children of Israel had a victory or enjoyed peace, they sang a song. Now, this song, why have been Suf, the brooks of Arnon, and the slope of brooks that reaches the dwelling of Ar and lies on the border of Moab? I'm not sure about the tune to that, but it has something to do with the travel they just made and how successful it was, and the fact they have no enemies. In fact, then it continues on that Moses gathers the people together and he says, I'll give them water. Well, this time they're not complaining. He gives them water. And then notice the song, spring up, O well, all of you sing to it. The well the leaders sank, dug by the nation's nobles, by the lawgiver, with their stave or with their staves. So now then you've got them digging a well. Why? Because he's going to supply water. He's going to supply water for them. But notice it says, spring up, O well. So now they're talking about this well, this water. They're just praising God for this water that's going to be provided. It's kind of interesting to me that it says that the leaders dug the well by the nobles with their staves or their staff. I don't know where that means they had the people do it with their staff, or where they did it with their staff, because water would have been close to the surface, and they could have just kind of scratched an area off without having to go too deep and find the water. But nonetheless, they used their staff in some way to do this. But you have two songs here immediately. And these songs are songs of joy, songs of rejoicing. You ever thought about the fact that we sing songs of rejoicing when we have those moments of victory, when we have those moments that we've overcome something? We like to sing, we like to shout, we like to praise God. And that's exactly what they're going to do. But then you come to verse 21, after they've gotten to the move, and in that third box, I want you to write the name Sihon, S-I-H-O-N. S-I-H-O-N. Sihon is going to be the king of the Amorites. Remember, the Amorites were an avowed enemy of the Israelites. And the Israelites asked Sihon, hey, buddy, can we go through your land? Hey, we're not going to bother anything. We just want to pass through the land, and we'll not drink your water. We won't go by your wells. We're going to leave everything alone. We're going to pass by the land. And Sihon said, no deal. You're not going. In fact, what I'm going to do, instead of letting you go to the land, is I'm going to gather all my people, my army, and I'm going to come and I'm going to fight you, and I'm going to defeat you. So the children of Israel try to be real gracious about this. And they tried to go through the land in a peaceful way. But Sihon is not going to have it. However, you come down to verse 24, and it says, then Israel defeated him with the edge of the sword and now took possession of his land. Well, he had his chance. They were going to leave him alone. But now then you come after me, there's going to be a fight. And notice, God's going to win the fight. And so we weren't going to take your land, but now we've got the land. An interesting sidebar, an interesting side fact here. All this takes place on the east side of the Jordan, which you'll remember Reuben, Gad, and I think half tribe of Manasseh. They have that side of the land after all the fighting goes on to conquer the land of Edom, the promised land. And so verse 25, Israel took all the cities that were there. But notice what happens in verse 27. You have another song. Come to Heshbon. Let it be built. Let the city of Sihon be repaired. For fire went out from Heshbon, a flame from the city of Sihon. It consumed Ar of Moab, the lords of the heights of the Arnon. Now Ar, we're going to see in Deuteronomy chapter 2, was a part of the land that God had given Lot. And so the Moabites obviously are descendants of Lot. And so they're going to be friends of God's people. But now then Amorites having captured them, but now then they're going to be free too. And so what you have is, he says, woe to you, Moab, you have perished, O people of Chemosh. He has given his sons as fugitive and his daughters into captives to Sihon, king of the Amorites, but we have shot at them. Heshbon has perished as far as Dibon, then we laid waste as far as Noph, and we reaches to Medba. So here, we just conquered the land. You conquered our people, and now then, Sihon, you're dead. And we've got your land. Then we come to verse 33. And before we go to Deuteronomy chapter 2 here, I want you to notice what it says in verse 34. Speaking of Og, he said, and the Lord said to Moses, do not fear him, for I have delivered him into your hand, and you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of Amorites, who dwelt at Heshbon. And the abbreviated form of this is, so they defeated him, his sons, all his people, until there wasn't a survivor left. Well, turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 2. Deuteronomy chapter 2, before we get to Og, I want you to take, and in that bottom square underneath the story, I want you to write Edom. Write Edom. Because now we're going to talk about the Edomites. And also, right under that, write Moab, M-O-A-B. Write Moab. Because now we're going to talk about the Edomites and the Moabites. Well, again, these should be friends of the children of Israel. You remember, the Edomites are descendants of Esau. And so God tells them, when you go through the land of Esau, he said, don't bother anything. In fact, what you need to do is you need to pay them some things. You need to pay them for what you're going to get from the land. And he says the same thing about Moab. Don't bother Moab. And they passed through Edom and Moab peacefully. There's not a problem at all. And you see that in chapter 2. And he says in verse 7, for the Lord your God has blessed you in all your work of your hand. He knows your trudgings through the great wilderness. These 40 years the Lord has been with you. You have lacked nothing, so you share that with the descendants of Esau. And then he said, verse 9, the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab, nor contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession, because I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession. That's what we talked about a moment ago. So God's already given this part of the land to Esau and also to Lot's descendants, the Moabites. But now we encounter something interesting in verse 10. Then the Emim dwelt there in times past, as great and as numerous and as tall as the Anakim. Do you remember who the Anakim is? Those are the giants. That was the tribe that Goliath came from. If you'll just switch real quick over to chapter 3 and look down at verse 11, it says something about the next person we're going to talk about. Then it says, for only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the giants. Indeed, his bedstead was an iron bedstead, 9 cubits its length, 4 cubits width, according to the standard cubit. And so what I want you to do in the next box next to Edom, I want you to write the name Og, O-G. Now, Og is going to be the king of the next tribe here, of Bashan. This description of Og here, probably about 13 and a half feet by 6 feet. It says his iron bed. Well, that wasn't a bed like we think of. That was probably his casket. That's what we'd call it. Or, here's a big word, and I'll try to simplify it, his sarcophagus. The sarcophagus was the place in which the casket was placed, and sometimes it was put over the casket as a means of preserving the body inside. And that box, that place where it was, that sarcophagus, that box was bigger than the individual that was inside. And so it could be the coffin was that big, or it could be this, we would call it a vault today. You have a coffin that goes in the ground and a vault goes over it. And that vault is bigger than the coffin itself. But nonetheless, he's an awfully big guy. Do you remember how tall Goliath, the size of Goliath? About 9'9". And this guy is, we'll be real liberal with it, between 7 feet and 13 feet tall. And he's evidently a wide guy, because even though the outside box was going to be 6 feet, there had to be a box that commensurate with that, kind of equal to that measurement on the inside. So here's a big wide guy, this Og was. Well, what's going to happen now is you're going to have the children of Israel are going to go fight Og, and they're going to be Og. But let's go back to chapter 2, and let's pick up the story in verse 11, because it's interesting. They were also regarded as giants like Anakim, but the Moabites called them Emim. And so now the children of Israel are going to cross the valley of Zered. The area of Moab here was a real mountainous area. I don't know how you envision that, but I don't have a good vision of that. I tried to log on and see some things on Google. But it's a tremendously mountainous area, and this valley was just kind of a stream that separated the land of Moab and the land of Edom, the land of Esau. But notice there's something interesting there in verse 15. For the hand of the Lord was against them. I'm sorry, back up to the verse 14. And the time we took from Kadesh Barnea until we crossed over the valley of Zered was 38 years, until all the generation of the men of war was consumed from the midst of the camp, just as the Lord had sworn. For indeed the hand of the Lord was against them to destroy them from the midst of the camp until they were consumed. So it was when all the men of war had finally perished from among them, the Lord spoke to me, saying, this day you are to cross Ar, the boundary of Moab. So what you have is now then all the generation that first came up to the river's edge of the promised land have now wandered through the wilderness for 38 years. And now the last one has died. And that's where they're at. The last one has died. But now then, as they're going to enter the land, and as they continue on, it says in verse 26, I sent messengers to Sihon, king of Heshbon, with words of peace, saying, let me pass through your land. I won't bother it. He would let him do it. And so you had the fight. And then we turn to Og, and Og is going to be just as stubborn, just as obstinate, just as he refusing the invitation to go through the land as Sihon was. And so they utterly destroyed all of Bashan, just like they did with Sihon, the king of Heshbon, utterly destroying everything there, men, women, children, city, livestock, everything that was there, everything is destroyed. That may sound cruel, but it's an act of judgment against these people, because the Amorites and Og of Bashan have been enemies of the children of Israel. And now they're going to come through the land, and they want to be peaceful. In the last box on that page, I want you to write the word song. The word song. And the reason that's important, sorry about that, going the wrong way. The reason that's important is I want to come back to, now that we've talked about these victories, to the times we read the three songs. Those three songs were songs in celebration. They were songs of celebrating what God had done for them. Do you remember when the children of Israel came across the Red Sea, and now they're victorious? Do you remember what happened? Miriam wrote a song. Miriam is probably about 90 years old at this time. And that song was a song of praise because they'd been redeemed, because they'd been delivered. Have you ever thought about when we sing songs? We sing songs because we've been redeemed. We sing songs because God has given us a victory. And so we praise him because of that. And that's what's taking place there. Now, as we move forward, I want to talk about some takeaways of this that I think are important. Backing up Numbers chapters 21, verses 10 through 12, there's not a problem one. There's no sin, there's no rebellion, there's no enemy. God was with them. And this was a victory for them. They've exited the land, they've wandered the land, and now then they've come through the curse of the serpent, and now then God has provided this peace for them. My point about that is that there'll be times that God uses us for great things, teaching, helping, and encouraging others in their daily walk with Christ. And there'll be prayers that God will answer. And each time we look back and see those victories, they ought to produce a song of joy. That's what we learn from, I think, Numbers chapter 21, verses 10 through 20. We come to Numbers chapter 21, verses 21 through 35, and the fight against Sihon, the king of the Amorites. They tried to make peace. And I think what that shows us is sometimes there's some people you can't make peace with, no matter how hard you try. But they gained a great victory. God gave them victory. And this was the beginning of a fulfillment of God's promise for the long-awaited promised land. This is the beginning of the fulfillment of that promise. And then we come to Og of Bashan. The children of Israel could have run away in fear. Moses' policy was the result of victories over Sihon and Og was that other nations were going to learn to fear them. So instead of the children of Israel being retreating in fear, what happens is all the other nations hear about how great God is. That's why when the children of Israel come into the promised land with the two spies, Rahab will say, "We've heard what your God has done." That's not only what God has done with the Red Sea and how God's provided for them. That's what God has done in delivering the enemies. It's important that we have that kind of belief in the power of God today. We attribute our blessings and good things in our lives to God, who's the giver of every good and perfect gift. We can help those who don't believe to start on a journey of faith. We magnify God and show how great He is by giving Him thanks both publicly and privately. People will ask about that. One of the results of victory of Israel over Sihon and Og was that Israel controlled the land east of the Jordan, and that land became part of the territory. When you think about our victories, how can we, in a sense, share the kind of victory that they had in Numbers chapter 21? We engage in battles today. We fight against sin and Satan and forces of darkness. We constantly face the need to resist temptation. Sometimes we fear losing the battle to be what God wants us to be. Sometimes as a congregation, we become discouraged because we think we're not accomplishing anything, or because like we are now, we're put out of what we usually do. We're not able to assemble like we would do. Like Israel, we can win the victories over enemies just as God's people did then because we still have the same God. We can conquer through Him. In fact, Paul said we overwhelmingly conquer through Him who loved us. And that's the theme of the whole thing. As Christians, we're traveling to the promised land. All kinds of difficulties and dangers seek to delay us. But if we keep traveling with God, we can reach our heavenly destination. Like those who are snake-bitten, we can gain the victory over death. Death is the sentence we deserve because of our sins, and yet we can conquer sins through Christ. When we come to Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 1 through 15, I think a takeaway from that is, I think what Satan wants us to do is forget about heaven. He wants us to settle down here. He wants us to forget about holy living. He wants us to forget about pleasing God. He wants us to forget about why we're here and to enjoy all this world has to offer. But don't give in to his lies. Can we enjoy this earth? Can we enjoy the blessings of this earth? We certainly can. But remember, we're citizens of a different country. Our eyes are on heaven. We keep living as if Jesus will return today and take us home. And we then sing, "This world is not my home, I'm just passing through." And then from verses 16 through 25, Deuteronomy chapter 2, I think there's something sobering about the thought that that generation had passed away. That first generation that had come out of the promised land, had seen all the mighty works of God, the mighty hand of God. They'd seen how big God was, how great and how mighty he was. They'd experienced that firsthand, but now then they're dying. And I think what that says to us is, as sober as that may be to think about, is every generation passes and hands the baton to the next generation. Much of who we are is because of the generation before us, our parents, those who taught us, those who raised us, those who sacrificed much to help us be strong, successful spiritually. Our parents' generations were not perfect, but they helped us with more than just words. They helped us understand how life is. And one day they'll be gone, and it's time to turn it to the next generation, our children. And so I think we need to appreciate the time that we have with every age group. I think we need to appreciate the time we have with every age group, the older age group and the younger age group. Why don't we invest this time in teaching our young children? Why don't we start at the earliest age and teach our young children? Is it because we have nothing better to do when we come together? No, we're trying to imprint the Word of God on their hearts, because one day we who are older are not going to be here. Somebody else is going to be sitting before a screen like this, teaching a lesson different than what I'm doing. But hopefully what we're doing is we're preparing a generation to follow us, to continue to be faithful to God in every aspect of our life. So when we teach our children those little songs, our God is so big, our God is so mighty, our God is so strong, there's nothing our God cannot do. We're not just teaching a song. We're teaching something that grows out of Deuteronomy chapter 21 and Deuteronomy chapter 2. When we help our children understand that the next generation is going to be them, it's important for them to learn the lessons that we have. But Satan wants to do his best to try to get us focused in a different direction. Let me pause and say something else here, tying all this together for just a moment. Satan loves nothing more than for us to be distracted. I know we don't have the literal land of the Amorites. I know we don't have the literal land of Bashan. But there are a lot of enemies of this world that are enemies of God. And those enemies challenge us to be faithful in our time of fighting, to be faithful and pure, just like the children of Israel. We may not have a giant that's 13 feet tall. We may not have a giant that's 9 feet tall, but we all have our giants. We all have those enemies, those demons that plague us. I would remind you of something I said earlier this year. We're in a spiritual battle. This was a battle for the promised land. These children of Israel are fighting a battle for the promised land. And we are too. And that begins with our little children. That begins helping our little children understand the value of God protecting them in this story. And so when I think about Jordan's book that he produced, I think there's some questions here that are good, that parents you can talk to about with your older kids, and maybe can also in some way reduce it to a level for the younger kids. First of all, what are some victories God has given you in life? Look back and talk about them as a family. And what are victories you have to overcome that are promised in Jesus? From Numbers chapter 21, verses 21 through 35. What does it mean to magnify God? Talk to your children about what it means to magnify God. Talk to your children about why the other nations feared Israel. And what have they heard? And what does that say about the confidence we should have in our God today? Talk to them about the fake news out there today. And what I mean by fake news is there are some common things that are heard about God that just are not true. God's not using this virus to test us and try us and see how faithful we're going to be. God doesn't use evil to do that. God's not going to test his children by putting a virus in front of them to see how faithful they're going to be. But I tell you what, the way we handle this is going to say a lot. I don't watch Dr. Phil hardly at all, but he came on just before our news this afternoon. I flipped over there. And he was talking about the anxiety that people are feeling today. He talked about the need to don't watch the news all day long. You can watch it 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes in the afternoon. Just kind of check in. In fact, if you watched it any length of time at all, it's kind of like a soap opera. The same story all day long. They just keep telling you how bad it is. No. Tune out and plug into God. Plug into these victories. Plug into how God gave Sihon and Og to the children of Israel. Share that story with your children. Don't buy into the anxiety of the day. I know this is challenging for us. I know this is threatening. I'm not diminishing the importance of washing your hands and at this point in time being six feet apart. I understand all that. Being in house, I understand all that. But listen, folks, the coronavirus is not what life is about. We need to keep our faith in place and don't let our fear overcome this. And that's what this story is about. It's about their fear overcoming their faith. And then next, in Jordan's little booklet, from Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 1 through 15, what was the land of Canaan like? Talk about that with your children. Then here's a challenging one. What will heaven be like? What a dream, what a vision. And then today, how are some ways that Satan tries to distract us from our promised land? We just talked about the virus, but that's not all. That's just in front of us today. What are some things that Satan uses to distract us from our goal? Satan wants our young people. He wants to start at the youngest age to capture them. Our young people are challenged today in our society, just like when I was young, we were. Many of the same things. Children want a place to belong. Children want identification. Children want to know not they're just loved, but they have a place. And what God is telling the children of Israel here in Numbers chapter 21 and Deuteronomy chapter 2 is, you're mine and I have a place for you. He even had a place for Edom and Moab, of all things, and said, don't bother them. Leave them alone. I'll give you Og, I'll give you Sihon into your hand. But look, Og and Sihon could have gotten away free if they'd have just let the children of Israel pass through the land. They weren't going to try to take anything from them. But instead they refused and they came after them, and the same thing happened to both of them. Well, we have enemies that chase us. Our children get involved in drugs. Our children get involved in every kind of evil because it's out there. That's the Sihon and the Og, except we're not going to pass through those land peacefully. They're the adversary. And we've got to defeat them. And then, what is the mentality of being a pilgrim passing through the land? What happens when we forget our goal? What happens when we don't keep our mind on heaven? And then from Deuteronomy chapter 2, children, ask your parents what their hope and desire is for you. Now you can achieve it. I wish I'd have thought of that with Cody and Cam. Youngest ones that can talk. Ask your parents what their hope and desire is for you. All the way down to the youngest age that can talk and can understand anything at all. And parents, put it in language they can understand. Next question is, what had the older generation seen and experienced? What were their strengths and what were their failures? And how will those help the next generation? Well, that's important. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to keep repeating history. What were the strengths and the failures of that first generation? Well, we know some of them because they're really overt. Because of unbelief, they turned away because of fear. And then ask your parents about the generation before them. How that generation helped them. And what they learned from that generation. And what challenges did that generation face? And what challenges have your parents faced? What challenges and opportunities do your parents see for your generation? Those are important questions. And Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 16 through 25 address those. There's something sobering about the thought of a passing generation. It's hard to imagine one day that you'll be older. I never imagined I'd be 65, but here I am. I never imagined our oldest grandson's going to be 20 in a few days, but here he is. We're growing up, folks, and we're growing older. And every generation has to replenish their presence before God and before this generation. And then finally, from Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 36 through 37, how can we know God will do all things? The Lord delivered Sihon, the king, and his cities into the hand of Israel. They tried to pass through peacefully. God delivered Og into their hands. They tried to pass through peacefully. Sometimes we limit God's power. That's too hard. The sickness is too strong. The problem is too great. There's no too, T-O-O, for God. There's no too hard, no too strong, no too deep, no too late. Not with God. He is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all we ask or think, and we see that in the defeat of the Amorites and the defeat of Og and Bashan. I remember the story in which the Lord encountered this man whose son he tried to take to the disciples to be healed. They couldn't. He brings him to the Lord and said, if you can. And the Lord said, if you can believe. And the man said, I believe, help thou my unbelief. There's nothing God cannot do. And that's why we sing that song. I tried to do it a little while ago. My God is so big and so strong and so mighty. There's nothing my God cannot do. There's nothing my God cannot do. How do we know God can do all things? Because we see this story. This story tells us, look at what God has done. God delivered the Amorites and God delivered Og and Bashan into the hand of the Israelites, and they entered the land. They conquered the east side and they entered the land and they began to conquer the land. The walls began to fall, the people began to flee, and word was spread about how mighty God was. And so tell the stories about how great God is. Tell the stories about the great things that God has done. This is a powerful lesson. This is a lesson of faith for God's protection. I just believe God's going to protect us. If not physically, at least eternally. And if we've got God on our side, and we've got God fighting battles through us and with us, then we have nothing to fear. The children of Israel did not fear when they went up against the Amorites and Og of Bashan. They did not fear. Why? Because God gave them the victory. God promised them the land, and he was not going to fail in giving his promise. Well, I hope that's been helpful tonight. I know I kind of spoke on a little higher level than what our younger kids could do, but I hope parents, you can take this and you can reduce it for them to help them. I guess if I'm speaking to McCoy and Easton, the two youngest of our grandchildren, what I want them to see in this story is I want them to see what God has done, how great God is. They want to understand all the nuances of this. But I want them to see how God fought for them, and they can learn that. At 6 years old, 7 years old, they can understand that. And you can talk about the battles that they face and the difficulties they face and help quiet the anxiety of your little ones about what's going on today. But to do that, parents, you're going to have your anxiety quieted. I know this is something, but it's really nothing. God is in control. Thanks for streaming in. Eric, thanks for your work. And I hope this is beneficial. This is my first run at this. So I pray you're long suffering with it. Hope everybody has a good night. Love you. I asked Jody to come up here with me, but she said no, she didn't want to see you. And so I guess it's just me all by myself. Now, the truth is she's downstairs watching me so she can see how I look. It's not any better up here than it is down there. But thanks a lot, folks. Have a good night. Bye.